Hey folks, welcome back to the Ingrain Workshop. Today we're going to be kicking off part 1 of the ultimate Outfeed Table build. So if you've ever struggled with workpiece support or you just want to upgrade your workshop, this is the project for you. I'll be walking you through the design, material, and the first building steps to a rock-solid Outfeed table that's as functional as it is good looking. So grab your cup of coffee and let's get to work. Alright folks, before we dive into the build, let's take a quick look at the game plan. And yes, believe it or not, you can teach a boomer new tricks because I drew this bad boy up in SketchUp. Here's the design for the ultimate Outfeed table. I'm going with castle joints and half laps at the legs to make things rock solid, because the last thing you want is your Outfeed table wobbling like a three-legged chair. On top of that, I've packed in multiple drawers for storage, plus a cabinet compartment for bigger items. The goal, maximum functionality, minimal wasted space. Alright, now you've seen the blueprint, let's get to making some sawdust. Alright folks, we're kicking things off here at the planer, milling down some old 2x4s. These might look familiar because they're leftovers from my old miter saw station. May it rest in peace. But hey, if you look in the background, you'll see the new and improved version. If you want to check out that build, I'll leave a link right here, or here, somewhere on the screen. Now I'm milling these down just enough to remove the old grizzly paint and get some fresh wood underneath. These boards are over 20 years old, which means they've seen things, but today they get a second chance at life. Over at the table saw, I'm taking an 1/8 inch off each side to get rid of the rounded edges. And just like that, I now have enough reclaimed wood to make 4 corner legs and 2 intermediate legs. My final leg dimensions need to be 3 inches square, so that means gluing up 3 pieces per leg. If you're using fresh 2x4s, you could get away with just 2 pieces, but where's the fun in that? Now it's time for the glue up. I started with my trusty glue bot, carefully squeezing out the glue and spreading it like I was frosting a cake, a really sticky cake. Then I clamped everything together using a mix of bar clamps and quick grips. But after one round of that, I decided to work smarter and not harder. So I just poured the glue straight from the bottle, slapped the pieces together, and clamped up 3 legs at a time. Way easier, and I saved myself some clamps for another project. Now you might not be able to see in the video, but as I clamped everything up, I made sure 1 2x4 sat proud of the others. That way, I'd have a nice square reference edge when I trim these down to their final dimensions. Fast forward to the next day, I pulled everything out of the clamps, marked my proud 2x4 to keep that factory edge for reference, and cleaned up any glue squeeze out with a chisel, because nothing says professional woodworker like making sure your glue mess doesn't ruin your cuts later. Alright, over at the bandsaw, I'm resawing just one face of each leg to remove the bulk of the extra wood, leaving me with a nice factory face on the opposite side. Then it's back to the planer to clean up that resawed face. And just like Groundhog Day, I found myself right back at the bandsaw resawing the other side, followed by another trip to the planer. At this point, I was half expecting Bill Murray to walk into the shop. But hey, after repeating the process, both faces of my legs were now milled to exactly 3 inches. I'm more fond of Caddyshack than Groundhog Day. I think that was a gopher, not a groundhog. But anyway, that gopher could get jiggy with it. Now it's time for the table saw. I'll start by running my factory edge 2x4 against the fence, then flip it around and make the final cut to get each leg to a perfect 3-inch square. And just like that, we've got ourselves some properly milled legs ready to support the ultimate Outfeed table like a champ. Over at the miter saw, I'm starting by cleaning up one end of all my legs, because even reclaimed wood deserves a fresh start. Next, I need to dial in the final height. So I measured my table saw, which came in at 34 3/4 inches. Now I've got to subtract 3/4 of an inch for the adjustable feet I'll be installing later, and another 1.5 inches for the Outfeed top, since I'll be stacking 2 layers of 3/4 inch MDF. That leaves me with a final leg height of 32.5 inches. I set my miter saw stop to that length and made the final cuts on the legs. Quick note here, the height of your table saw might be different. So be sure to double check your own measurements unless you want an Outfeed table that's either too tall or doing the limbo. With that, I now have 6 perfectly cut legs ready to start bringing this build to life. With a chamfer bit chucked up at the router table, I've set the height to 1/4 of an inch and I'm cutting a nice clean chamfer on the leg corners. This will help ease the edges and, more importantly, soften the blow the next time I accidentally run into them, which, let's be honest, is inevitable. Next, I'm adding the same chamfer to just the bottom of each leg. Not only does this give it a cleaner, more finished look, but it also makes adjusting the feet a little easier. Because if there's one thing I've learned, it's that anything that makes shop adjustments easier is always worth the extra step. Now it's time to crown these legs because we're playing chess while everyone else is playing checkers. A couple of weeks ago, I built a table saw jig specifically for this job, and I'll leave a link in the video description below if you want to check that out. It's not mandatory, but I did swap out my normal table saw blade for a flat bottom blade. Setup here is critical, I'm not going to lie. My backside was pretty tight. No room for error on this one. I'm cutting a groove in the middle of each leg, 1/4 of an inch wide and 3 inches high. That's going to leave 7/8 of an inch on either side of the groove. And to keep things consistent and human error out of the equation, I turned on my workshop AI, aka good old common sense. Instead of consistently adjusting the fence, I'm making my first cut, then simply rotating the leg to make 2 more identical cuts on the sides. Once I've got those initial cuts on one end of the leg, I'll repeat the same process on the other end without moving the fence. And just like before, I'll rinse and repeat for the remaining 4 legs. See why Groundhog Day appears to be the theme to this video? If you do this properly, and the key here is making sure each leg is perfectly 90 degrees to the table saw top before every cut, you should end up with a groove that's exactly 7/8 of an inch from the edge of all sides. With that done, it's time to hog out the remaining material inside the groove. This part's simple, just light passes, removing 1/8 of an inch at a time. Now I did use a plywood backer on the back of these legs to minimize tear out on the back side of my cut. But once you've done that, rinse and repeat, and before you know it, we've got ourselves some properly crowned legs. Finally, we're done with the legs. Now we can move on to the stretchers because every good table needs some solid support. I'll be making both top and bottom stretchers, which will sit inside the castle joints with overlapping half-lap joints. I know it sounds fancy, but it's really just good old woodworking engineering. I'm starting at the miter saw to cut the stretchers to their final lengths, 65 inches and 74 inches respectively. This will be a total of 8 stretchers, 4 at 65 inches and 4 at 74 inches, so there's plenty of cutting to do. With those final lengths set, I'll move over to the table saw to clean things up. First, I'll cut off the rounded edges, because we don't need any factory curves messing up our journey. Then I'll trim them down to a final width of 3 inches. And just like that, we're one step closer to making this ultimate outfeed table live up to its name. So as you can see, my shopping cart runneth over. So starting at the left, I've got 2 intermediate legs. I've got 4 corner legs that are complete. And then I've got 8 stretchers. So we've still got some work to do on the 2 intermediate legs and then on all 8 stretchers. Next up, I need to finish the joints on the stretchers. And just like before, we're back in Groundhog Day mode. I'm starting with the shoulder cut. I'll lay it out 1 inch from the end of the stretcher, then cut it 3 inches long at a depth of 1/8 of an inch. And since I have to make this shoulder cut 4 times per stretcher across 8 stretchers, that's a grand total of 32 cuts. Did I mention Groundhog Day? To get this done, I'm using my router and router fence, setting it up similarly to my table saw jig. I've got a 3/4 inch flush cut bit chucked up, and I'll position the fence for the first pass, exactly 1 inch from the end. Then I'll go ahead and repeat that 32 times. After that, I'll adjust my router fence to make a pass at the 3-inch mark, then hog out the remaining material before moving on to the next shoulder. But before I get too carried away, I'll do a test fit with one of the legs, just to make sure everything is dialed in before committing to the full batch. Measure twice, cut 32 times, right? Alright, back to the miter saw to cut the interlocking half-lap joints because clearly I love repetitive tasks. I've got my miter saw stop set, so my first cut will be exactly 7/8 of an inch from the inside of the shoulder. I also set my depth stop to 1.5 inches deep. But here's a little trick. I use some scrap wood to space my piece away from the fence. Why? Because if you cut too close to the fence, the blade's curvature will leave you with a rounded cut, and we definitely don't want that. And just like with the shoulder cuts and the castle joints on the legs, I'm making the first cut on all the stretchers. So that's 16 cuts for those keeping score at home. Then I'll move my fence out 1¼ inches, make the opposite half lap cut, and hog out the remaining material one painstaking 1/8 inch pass at a time. Feel free to wake me up from this woodworking nightmare at any time. Once I've hogged out the material on 2 joints, I'll do a test fit to make sure everything is copacetic, because nothing ruins your day like realizing you've made 16 bad cuts in a row. One last thing to do on the stretchers: drill some pocket holes. This will let me screw the top to the table, and if I ever need to replace it in the future, I can just unscrew it from the base instead of taking a sledgehammer to my hard work. The good news: I only need to do this on 4 stretchers. Wow, look at that. The number of repetitive cuts is finally coming down. Almost feels like a vacation. But I don't want to spoil myself. There's no room for Peter Pan on this hunt. With the stretchers finally complete, I can turn my attention to my long-neglected intermediate legs. These poor guys have been sitting in the cart, patiently waiting, kind of like my kids in the cart, Dairy Queen. Over at the table saw, I've got a 3/4 inch dado stack set up with the blade height dialed in at 1½ inches. Using my miter gauge, I'll make my first cut exactly 3 inches down from the top of the leg. Then, just like before, I'll hog out the remaining material one pass at a time. Once that's done, I'll repeat the same process on the bottom of the leg, creating 2 half-lap joints. And because I like to keep things fair, I'll give the other intermediate leg the same treatment. No favoritism in this shop. So I didn't feel safe cutting at 1½ inches, so I lowered my dado stack to 3/4 inch, and then I just made the cut in 2 passes. Once the joint was cut, I used the actual stretcher to test fit the joint. And there you have it, finally. Finally, all the lumber for the base has been milled, jointed, and prepped. It took a bit of patience and a lot of sawdust and possibly a few gray hairs, or in my case, no hairs, but we made it. Next up, we move on to the glue-up process, because if there's anything better than cutting a bunch of wood, it's sticking it all back together again. Because this is a family channel, I'm going to spare you the X-rated sanding process. Trust me, there was a lot of fussing and maybe a little cussing and definitely some questioning of life choices. But I'm sure you've seen sanding before, so let's just pretend it magically got done and move on. Before I commit to a glue up, I'm doing a quick dry fit, because once the glue comes out, there's no turning back. If any joints need a little fine tuning, I'll break out a chisel and dial them in so everything fits nice and snug. This is the part where I cross my fingers and hope all that measuring, cutting, and hogging out actually paid off. Just for my own self-satisfaction and to prove to myself that I actually know what I'm doing, I decided to throw a square on it just to make sure everything looks good. Once it's glued up, I'll check it again and make any necessary adjustments, because let's be honest, no matter how careful you are, wood has a mind of its own. As you can see, to minimize any glue squeeze out and to avoid spending the afternoon scraping dry glue, I went ahead and applied some painter's tape to all the joints. Now I'm taking the slow and steady approach, applying glue to the joints first and then the stretchers, because in woodworking, like in life, a little patience goes a long way. With the top stretchers glued in place, it's time to check my diagonals for square, because a wonky base isn't going to do me any favors. Luckily, everything checked out, so no adjustments needed this time. But if things were off, now would be the time to throw some clamps on it and rack it square before the glue sets and I have to live with my mistakes forever. I'll let this set up, then flip the base and glue up the bottom stretchers the same way, because what's better than one glue up? 2 glue ups. Before the glue sets up on the top, I'm going to locate the center of my interlocking half lap and mark it with an awl, because eyeballing it just isn't my style. Next, using a 1-inch Forstner bit, I'll drill a recess hole about 3/16 of an inch deep, just enough for the head of my screw to sit flush with the top of the stretcher. Then, to avoid any unwanted wood splitting drama, I'll pre-drill a hole about 4½ inches down from the top and drive in a 4½ inch GRK screw to lock that joint in place. I'll repeat this on all 4 corners at the top, but I'm skipping the bottom since I'll be installing adjustable feet, because no one likes a wobbly workbench. With the base flipped and the bottom stretchers glued up, it's time to lay out the adjustable feet, because a wobbly table is only fun if it's in a diner. First, I'll locate the center of my interlocking half lap and mark it with an awl. Then, using an 1.5-inch Forstner bit, I'll drill a recess hole for the foot. Turns out I didn't leave myself a ton of adjustment room when I measured for the table height, so I'm recessing these about 1/2 inch deep to make it work. Pro tip here, you can always make the table a little shorter and use the feet to raise it, but if you make it too tall, well, you're out of luck. With the recess holes drilled, I'll drill a 5/16 inch hole for the foot adjustment about 2 inches deep. Then with the foot base in place, I'll use the self-centering drill bit to drill out the 3 holes for the mounting. After that, I'll screw the base down using the provided screws. And for anyone interested, I'll leave links to the adjustable feet in the video description. Last step, just screw in the foot and boom, we're officially adjustable. Next, I'm installing the intermediate legs in the center of the base on each side, because this table deserves all the support it can get. I'll start by applying some glue to the half lap joint, then position the leg in place, making sure it's plumb and centered. Once I'm happy with it, I'll clamp it down. Now to lock it in, I'll pre-drill and countersink some holes and drive in a couple of 2-inch JRK screws at the top and bottom of each leg. With that, the intermediate legs are rock solid and this base is really starting to come together. Next, I need to install 2 vertical dividers, one in the back and one in the front. The back divider will separate the drawer compartment, while the front one is just for extra support. You won't see that one since it'll be facing the table saw, kind of like an unsung hero in the build. I'll secure both dividers to the top and bottom stretchers using pocket hole screws, keeping everything nice and sturdy. Simple, strong, and one step closer to a fully functional outfeed table. Now it's time to lay out the horizontal support pieces. These will be the same size as the stretchers and add some much needed stability. I've got 2 middle horizontal supports, one at the top and one at the bottom, both measuring 55.5 inches long. I'll secure these with pocket hole screws. For the top support, I went ahead and drilled some extra pocket holes that'll come in handy when installing the tabletop later. Also adding 2 more horizontal supports on either side of the middle one. These will be 58.5 inches long, and just like the others, I've pre-drilled pocket holes for attaching the top. With these in place, the base is getting even more solid. This thing is built to last. With the base complete, I figured now's a good time to go ahead and stain it. First, I'm applying Minwax pre-stain to the exterior. Just like regular stain, you wipe it on with a cotton cloth, let it soak in for about 20 minutes, then wipe off the excess. For the stain itself, since you probably can't read the label, I'll save you the trouble. It's Minwax Special Walnut. If you've been following the channel for a while, and let's be honest, that's probably not many of you, you know I like using contrasting stains in my workshop. Special Walnut and Golden Pecan. You'll get to see the Golden Pecan make its grand entrance in part 2. Deal with the stain, wipe it on, wait 20 minutes, wipe off the excess. And once this whole outfeed table is complete, I'll finish it off with some wipe-on poly to really make it shine. There it is, the completed base. You can also see my miter saw station in the background, and if you look closely, you'll notice how the stains match. That's not by accident. That's just me pretending I have a grand master plan for my shop aesthetics. Well, that's a wrap for part 1 of the ultimate outfeed table build. We got off to a solid start, but there's plenty more to come in part 2, so stay tuned. If you enjoyed it, then please leave it a thumbs up, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you won't miss out on the next step. And as always, if you've got any questions or suggestions, leave them in the comments section below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time in the Ingrain Workshop.